As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. You must be on your guard. You'll be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given to you at the time, for it is not you speaking but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and their nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequalled from the beginning, when God created the world, until now, and never to be equalled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Messiah," or "Look, there he is," do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know the summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about that day or hour nobody knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned tasks, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch.
These are some quite heavy verses, and there's quite a lot of them. It's the longest piece of extended talking from Jesus in Mark's Gospel. And so it didn't feel fair to just read half of it. They're not easy verses. They've been described by some as the most misunderstood and misused verses in Mark's Gospel. one commentator describes them as the most difficult verses to interpret in all of the Gospels. And we're actually going to spend 2 weeks thinking about these verses because I think they probably deserve more than one. My original plan was to split it somewhere in the middle and find some nice halfway point and spend 1 week on half of the verses and 1 week on the other half. But actually I've gone for something different, and we're going to spend the next 2 weeks, today and next week, looking at Mark 13 as a whole from two different angles. And as I've been reading around these verses, it's become clear there are different viewpoints on how we should interpret these verses, and there's three that are sort of the main three. The first viewpoint is that these verses are primarily about the end of the world. This is perhaps a common approach, but actually I think there's quite a wide range of varying beliefs within this. You know, there are some who will even now be pointing to the rumours of war with Ukraine as a sign that the end is near. But I know even further than that, there are some who are pushing really hard for the temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem so that the abomination that causes desolation can be fulfilled and the end times can come about, not because they particularly want to worship there. Others have attempted to use these verses and other scriptures to attempt to create an apocalyptic timetable, a blueprint for the end of the world. And I even heard about an American Christian broadcaster who crunched all the numbers, did some biblical maths, and declared that Jesus would come again on May 21st, 2011. And when that didn't happen, he said he got his maths wrong and put it 6 months later, and that also didn't happen. I think there are a few questions to ask of this approach, if I'm honest, particularly the most extreme ends of this approach, which does try and make that apocalyptic timetable. The most obvious, perhaps, is this statement of Jesus that this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. But also Jesus' words that nobody knows when he is returning. Though some have argued that actually Jesus says nobody knows the day or hour, but we can probably work out the year. Actually, the second approach to these verses is to say, well, they have nothing to say about the end of the world, and actually these verses are purely verses about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. This approach points out that Jesus is asked a question about the destruction of the temple, and it's that he's responding to. Actually, it makes sense of Jesus' words about this generation not passing away, because a generation was considered 40 years, and the destruction of the temple happened within 40 years of Jesus saying his words. The argument too is that actually all these things can be related to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. That actually when it says the gospel must be preached to all nations, well actually that happened at the day of Pentecost, where it tells us there were Jews present from all nations. Actually it tries to explain away some of these things. And this view is quite well developed within scholarship, and in some ways it seems to make sense, but it doesn't leave me completely convinced, and it is not without its own questions. The third view, and I think is probably the one that I find myself most drawn to, although I'll put my hands up and say I don't know all the answers, I don't fully understand what this verse is talking about. But the third view is that actually both of these things are true. That these verses are both about the destruction of the temple in the first century and also about Jesus' return, about the end of the world. As you might expect, there's variation within this viewpoint as well about which bits refer to which. But for me, this view takes into account the reality that Jesus' disciples, that Mark's original readers would have found themselves in, but also acknowledges that these verses do have things to say to us about the end of the world, about Jesus' return. And so as we look at these verses over the next 2 weeks, actually we're going to look at them in two different ways. And this week we are going to think about what these verses might have meant for Jesus' disciples and to those original readers of Mark. We're going to think about how they might link to the destruction of the temple and the events surrounding that, and this will then lead us into communion. Next week then we'll spend some more time thinking about what these verses mean for us today, what these verses might have to tell us about the end of the world and about Jesus' return. And to start us off today, I've just got a question for you. and don't turn to your neighbour, but if anybody wants to answer this out loud, then you're more than welcome. But I wonder, what is the most beautiful place, the most awe-inspiring place that you have been to? Particularly, we'll go for man-made. We won't go for the Grand Canyon, but anything particularly, any buildings that you found or anything like that. What is the most beautiful or awe-inspiring place that you remember going to? If anybody wants to answer, that's fine. If not, I'll just answer. But I'll give you a moment. I remember going as a teenager to Dubrovnik. I don't know if any of you have been to Dubrovnik, but we had a one-night stop when I was about 16, 17, and we were on our way to a mission trip in Bosnia, but it was very expensive to fly straight to Bosnia, so we flew to Dubrovnik, stayed one night in the old town. And if you've been to the centre of the old town, it is beautiful. I remember turning up to it and thinking it felt like something out of a movie set. It had these stone walls surrounding the old town from the 16th century, paved limestone floors, stone-built buildings, and it was, there were moments when the sun was literally glistening off the streets. It was beautiful. It was visually stunning. And Mark 13 starts with one of Jesus' disciples almost having these same feelings about the temple, admiring the temple. Look, what massive stones, what a magnificent building. Actually, this was probably a quite appropriate and understandable response, because it was a beautiful, very awe-inspiring building. Actually, a first century historian talks about the largest stone in the temple being 68 feet long, 9 feet high and 8 feet wide. And actually, the largest one that's been excavated so far is 40 feet long, which is just slightly smaller than a badminton court. And it weighs about 500 tons. This building was described as the most beautiful building in the whole world. But in some ways, this seems like an odd explanation, because Jesus has just spent the rest of the day in the temple, challenging the temple structures, the temple leaders, challenging what's going on there, challenging their empty religion. And the disciple then comes and admires this building. And Jesus responds to this. Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. As the disciples, declare, well, this is such a beautiful building, Jesus talks about its destruction. The disciples are shocked, and they come and find a quiet moment with Jesus later on where they're on the Mount of Olives. They come and ask him, when is this going to take place? What kind of signs will there be? And I think it is important that we acknowledge this question, because actually it is this question that leads us into the next verses. They hint to us that these verses do have something to say about the destruction of the temple. It doesn't mean they're not saying anything about the end of the world. But I don't think they're a blueprint for what's going to happen before the world ends. And in his response, Jesus warns his disciples of a lot of things, as we've heard. He warns them to watch out for people that are coming to deceive, for false messiahs. He gives warnings of wars and rumours of wars, nations rising against nations, kingdom rising against kingdom, of earthquakes, of famine. He warns that the disciples will be arrested, they'll be taken to court, they will stand before governors and kings, and actually as they do, that the Holy Spirit will speak through them. Brother will betray brother, Mark tells us. Father his children, children their parents. And it generally doesn't sound like a very nice sight. Tom Wright suggests that this first chunk of verses from 3 to 13, which mentions all these things, assumes that there is going to be this great catastrophe which will cause the temple to be destroyed. And in the run-up to this, Jesus' followers will find themselves at all these risks. Along with his warnings about his death that we've seen earlier in Mark's Gospel and we'll see more of, Jesus is making it clear that there will be a time when he will not be there physically leading his disciples, encouraging his disciples. A future in which they will face what he has faced. Trials, beatings, threat of death, all because of their allegiance to him. But he also sees this future of his followers continuing on together and suffering for him. But these things, Mark says, Jesus tells us, actually these things we've heard so far, well, they're not to panic when these things happen. Even when they are put on trial, they are not to think that these things are the end. That these things, the earthquakes, the wars, the rumours of wars, these things, they are not to panic. These things must happen. Instead, they are, Jesus says, to stand firm. But when we get to verse 14, we see a shift in direction. However, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing there, let the reader understand. Which implies that the reader might not understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Having been encouraged to stand firm, now at a given signal they are to flee. Something will happen that will tell them that it's time to run. There's no time to look back. There's no time to go home and pick up your belongings, but just to run. This is the moment when the disaster is coming upon Jerusalem. Something that will far overshadow the previous troubles of the world. Now, I didn't really enjoy history that much at school. I didn't really not enjoy it, but it wasn't my preferred subject. But we are going to have a bit of a history lesson. And actually, history tells us that the war broke out in Jerusalem in 66 AD, when actually it was the greatest of the Jewish revolts against the Romans. For a while this was successful. Jerusalem became the centre of violent resistance against Rome, and it actually took Rome 4 years to retake Jerusalem, and another 3 years to eliminate the last of the resistance. First century historian Josephus tells the story of the siege on Jerusalem. And by all accounts, it was tough, it was difficult. People starved, there was starvation, people actually ate their own children to survive. There was infighting between different factions of Jews, there was famine. Actually, more Jews were being killed by other Jews than the invading Romans, according to Josephus. In his time, there were also many false messiahs who were offering a rescue, offering signs and wonders, trying to gain a following, but all of whom came to nothing. And Jesus clearly wants his followers to avoid this. Actually, when they see that this is about to happen, to get out and run. When they see this sign, the abomination that causes desolation. Actually, these words seem a bit odd to us, don't they? Actually, they refer back to the book of Daniel, which speaks of armies invading Jerusalem, stopping regular sacrifices in the temple, and setting up this desolating abomination. Jesus and Mark don't really give us any more clues to what this might be, but some scholars have suggested that actually this was the Roman army descending on Jerusalem, descending on the temple. Actually, the Roman armies, they argue, were always an abomination because they carried with them idolatrous images of the emperor, declaring him to be the Son of God. The emperor who they worshipped. Those armies brought desolation, it's argued, because their commander levelled the city, entered the Holy of Holies, defiling it with these idolatrous images, even making offerings to the Roman emperor in it. Actually, Luke's Gospel seems to back up this understanding. As it says in Luke 21, actually, when Jesus is saying these words in Luke's Gospel, he says, "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Actually, the main climax of this war, the Great War, is, as Jesus is warning, the destruction of the temple. As the Romans retake Jerusalem, the temple ends up destroyed. And it's in this context that Mark writes his Gospel. The general consensus is that Mark wrote his Gospel around 70 AD, and 70 AD was when the temple was destroyed. Mark is writing his Gospel around the time of this destruction, of this great war. And this writing in Mark reminds us and shows us and tells us about the horrors of this first war, this great war, and the destruction of the temple. Ben Witherington comments, it wasn't the end of the world, but it was the end of a world. It was the end of their world. And it led to the Jews being, again, a people in exile for nearly 2,000 years. So as Mark writes, the world as the early Christians knew it is crumbling. The temple in Jerusalem is being destroyed. Early leaders like Paul and Peter are surely gone. The church within this break from Judaism. It also appears that false teachers are seeking to draw away believers from the church. And Borg and Crossan theologians tell us of specific difficulties for Christians at this time, for Mark's readers. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, they were an anti-imperial movement, spurred on by the message from Jesus of the kingdom of God, which found them opposed to the Roman imperialism of the day. But following Jesus also led them to a path of non-violence, which set them apart from the Jewish resistance. In those days, people thought to be rebels were killed by the Romans, and people thought to be collaborators were killed by the rebels. And to be neither meant that Christians were suspect to both camps. Hence the warnings of being taken up to court before emperors and kings. Hence the warnings of persecution, of family betraying family. But for Mark's readers, I think that these words would be seen in many ways as a vindication of Jesus' message. If what Jesus has said about the temple has come true, then surely he is God's Messiah, he is God's chosen one, and all that he said, all that Mark has written about him, is true. Actually, for Mark's readers, even when they face trials, persecutions, even as they find themselves at the end of the world as they know it, they can have faith in all that Jesus said and did. And if this event is the end of their world, the end of the world as they know it, then actually it is also the beginning of a new one. The same day that Jesus speaks these words in chapter 13, and the day before, we see Jesus challenging the temple, challenging its empty sacrifices, its empty rituals. We see him condemn those in charge, those who have abused the system and made it unfit for purpose. And as we look forward, soon we will be exploring Jesus' final days, his death, his resurrection. And we will discover that the temple is no longer needed. That we no longer need a place where we can come and meet God in the Holy of Holies, because God dwells amongst us. We no longer need a place where we can bring our sacrifices to atone ourselves, because Jesus' death on the cross is the ultimate sacrifice. We look forward into a world where God's kingdom has come through the person of Jesus, and where God's kingdom continues to come. We look forward to when it comes in its fullness. As I mentioned, next week we will think about a bit more what these verses mean for us, more about what they say about the end of the world and Jesus' second coming. But they finish by encouraging us, and they finish, I think, by encouraging the first century readers that Jesus is coming again. Nobody knows when, not even Jesus knows. But the promise is that Jesus will return. And the command that follows that is not then, as many have tried to do, to work out a prophetic timetable for the end, but to watch, to stay awake, to stay alert, to remain faithful to God, and to stand firm, even when the world around them, even when the world around us seems as though it is falling, it is failing. Actually, we can trust in this promise that whatever chaos is going on around us, whatever chaos was going on for those early Christians, we can look forward to the presence and person of Jesus with us when he comes again. For those early Christians, it was an encouragement, as their life was in so much turmoil, to stand firm, to stay faithful, to stand true to the words of God, the words that Jesus tells us will never fade, even as the world that they know it does. And that is an encouragement for us too today. I won't say too much more, otherwise I won't have anything to say next week. But it is an encouragement for us today, as we've been through the last 18 months, 2 years of COVID, as actually things have shifted. Our world has changed. There is encouragement that God is faithful, that his word remains true, that Jesus will come again. In a moment we are going to come to communion, and we are going to remember Jesus' death on the cross. We are going to remember the sacrifice that was made so that we would not need to sacrifice the temple. We are going to remember that as the temple was destroyed, Jesus' body was broken. But actually, unlike the temple, 3 days later, he came back to life.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should